would arrive with certainty. A clear sign, a defining moment, a reason that could be explained. That's how we're taught to understand the world. We search for evidence. We look for logic. We want every feeling to have a source and every change to have a beginning. But the truth is, some of the most powerful things you'll ever experience don't arrive that way. They arrive quietly. So quietly that at first, you don't even realize they're changing you. And that's exactly what happened here. Because if someone had asked me months ago whether a single person could alter the way I see my entire world without forcing anything, without demanding attention, without even trying, I would have said no. Not because I don't believe in connection, but because I've always believed that meaningful things require visible effort. They require time, distance crossed, trust earned, walls lowered, a process. Yet somehow, what happened between us ignored every rule I thought I understood. And that's why I've spent so much time trying to make sense of it. Not because I wanted to deny it, because I wanted to understand it. There's a difference. Most people assume understanding comes before feeling. That first, you understand something, then you allow yourself to believe it. But sometimes life reverses the order. Sometimes you feel something long before you can explain it. And that's what made this difficult. Because from the very beginning, there was something unusual about the way you entered my thoughts. Not dramatically, not constantly, not in a way that demanded attention. It was almost the opposite. You became present in the smallest moments, the moments nobody talks about, the quiet spaces between responsibilities, the few seconds before sleep, the brief pauses during busy days. Those moments where your mind naturally drifts toward whatever matters most. And somehow, you kept appearing there. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was temporary, a passing curiosity, a coincidence, because coincidences are easy to accept. They don't require us to change anything, but eventually, there comes a point where something happens too many times to remain a coincidence. And that's when I started paying attention. I started noticing how different everything felt around you, not because you were trying to impress me, not because you were trying to become important. Actually, what stood out most was the absence of effort. You weren't performing. You weren't creating a version of yourself designed to be admired. You simply existed. And somehow that honesty became impossible to overlook, because most people spend their lives presenting polished versions of themselves. Versions carefully designed for acceptance. Versions designed to fit expectations. But with you, I never felt that. What I felt was authenticity. And authenticity is rare. Rare enough that when you encounter it, something inside you immediately recognizes the difference. It's like hearing a familiar melody you've never heard before. You can't explain why it feels familiar. You just know it does. And that's exactly how this felt. Familiar. Not because we'd shared years together, not because of history, not because of memories, but because something about your presence felt strangely understood, as if part of me recognized something before my mind had time to analyze it. That realization unsettled me, because I've always trusted analysis. I've always trusted reason. Logic creates structure. Logic creates safety. Logic creates control. And control has always been comfortable. When you understand something, you know where to place it. You know how much importance to give it. You know what it means. But this connection refused to stay inside those boundaries. The more I tried to categorize it, the more it escaped definition. Friendship didn't fully explain it. Admiration didn't explain it. Curiosity didn't explain it. Every explanation felt incomplete, like describing the ocean by talking only about water, technically correct, but missing the entire experience. And maybe that's why I stopped searching for labels, because labels weren't bringing clarity. They were creating distance. They were reducing something meaningful into something smaller than it actually was. What mattered wasn't what this connection was called. What mattered was what it was doing. Because little by little, it was changing the way I experienced life. I found myself noticing things I usually overlooked, thinking differently, reflecting more deeply, questioning assumptions I had carried for years, not because you told me to, not because you influenced me directly, but because your existence created a perspective I couldn't ignore. And that's when the realization finally arrived, not suddenly, not dramatically, quickly, just like everything else. I realized this wasn't normal. Not because it was intense, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was consistent, day after day, Moment after moment, the feeling remained, the understanding remained, the awareness remained, and consistency is powerful, more powerful than excitement, more powerful than emotion, because excitement fades. Emotion changes, but consistency stays. Consistency reveals truth, and the truth was becoming impossible to avoid. This connection was different, different from anything I had expected, different from anything I could easily explain. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't sure whether I wanted an explanation. Because, as maybe some things lose their meaning when they're reduced into simple answers. Maybe some connections aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to be experienced. And maybe that's why, despite all my attempts to understand it, one thought continues returning to me again and again. This connection isn't normal. This is different. There comes a moment when you can no longer convince yourself that something is accidental. Not because the feeling becomes louder, but because it becomes impossible to ignore. And that's where everything started changing for me. For a long time, I treated this connection like something temporary, something that would eventually fade into the background like countless other experiences before it. That's what happens with most things, isn't it? People enter your life, they leave impressions, they create memories, then time slowly carries everything away. The feeling weakens, the significance fades, and eventually, all that's left is a story you rarely revisit. I assumed this would be the same. I expected the distance to grow naturally. I expected the thoughts to become less frequent. I expected familiarity to replace curiosity, because that's how these things usually work. But strangely, the opposite happened. The more time passed, the more present you became. Not in a demanding way, not in a way that interrupted my life, in a way that quietly integrated itself into it. And that difference mattered, because there are people who occupy your attention. Then there are people who occupy your awareness. Attention is temporary. Awareness is deeper. Attention can be distracted. Awareness stays with you, even when you're focused elsewhere. And somehow you'd become part of that deeper space. I noticed it in small moments. Moments most people would never think twice about. I'd hear a thought and immediately wonder what your perspective would be. I'd experience something meaningful and instinctively wish I could share it with you. I'd encounter an idea and imagine the conversation it might create. None of it was intentional. That was the strange part. I wasn't trying to think about you. My mind simply kept finding its way back. And eventually, I had to ask myself why. Why was this happening? Why did your presence feel different from everyone else's? Why did something so quiet carry so much weight? At first, I searched for logical answers. Maybe it was admiration. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was familiarity. Maybe it was comfort. But every explanation felt incomplete, because the truth was bigger than any single reason. You weren't important because of one thing. You were important because of 1,000 small things. The way you understood without needing lengthy explanations. The way you listened without trying to control the conversation. The way you allowed silence to exist without rushing to fill it. The way your presence felt calm instead of demanding. Most people don't realize how rare that is. We live in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, trying to be noticed, trying to prove their value, trying to earn significance. But you never seemed interested in any of that. And somehow, that made your significance impossible to overlook, because genuine people don't force connection. They create space for it. And that's exactly what happened. You created a space where I didn't feel pressured to become anything other than myself. No performance, no expectations, no carefully constructed version, just honesty, and honesty is powerful, much more powerful than perfection. Perfection impresses people. Honesty reaches them. It reaches places perfection never can. Maybe that's why this connection continued growing, because it wasn't built on admiration, it wasn't built on fantasy, it wasn't built on idealized versions of reality. It was built on something much stronger, recognition, the feeling of being understood, not partially, not conditionally, completely. And once you've experienced that, everything changes, because most of us spend our lives being interpreted. People see pieces of us and assume they understand the whole picture. They collect fragments and create conclusions. They decide who we are before they've truly seen us. And after a while, you become accustomed to it. You stop expecting deeper understanding. You accept being known only on the surface, until someone arrives who sees beyond it. Someone who notices things you never explained. Someone who understands things you never said. Someone who recognizes emotions hidden beneath ordinary words. And when that happens, something inside you shifts. You begin questioning how much of yourself you've kept hidden. You begin wondering whether all those walls were really necessary. Because maybe the walls weren't protecting you anymore. Maybe they were simply preventing you from being known. That thought stayed with me, long after our conversations ended, long after the moments themselves passed, because every meaningful interaction seemed to reveal the same truth. I felt more like myself around you, not a better version, not a different version, myself. And that's a rare feeling, rare enough that many people spend their entire lives searching for it, reaching for someone who doesn't require a performance, someone who doesn't demand constant proof, someone who doesn't make love, trust, or understanding feel conditional, someone who simply accepts what exists. And perhaps that's why I couldn't dismiss this as coincidence anymore. Coincidences don't consistently change the way you experience life. Coincidences don't quietly alter your perspective. Coincidences don't create lasting impact. This did. Every day, I became more aware of that truth, and with awareness came another realization. The thing that frightened me wasn't the connection itself, it was what the connection revealed. Because once you realize someone matters, you lose the ability to pretend they don't. You lose the comfort of denial. You lose the safety of distance. Suddenly, you're faced with something real, something meaningful, something capable of changing you. And change has always been something I approach carefully, not because I fear it, because I respect it. Anything powerful enough to change your life deserves your attention. And this was powerful. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The way sunlight slowly changes a room without announcing itself. The way seasons shift before you notice the leaves have changed. The way certain songs become part of your memories before you realize why. That's how this happened. Slowly, naturally, without force. Until one day I looked back and realized something undeniable. I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. The way I viewed connection had changed. The way I viewed trust had changed. The way I viewed myself had changed. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether this feeling was real. Because the evidence was everywhere. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic moments. In consistency, in presence, in understanding, in all the quiet ways your existence had become woven into my life. And that's when I finally admitted something I had been avoiding for a very long time. This wasn't a coincidence. It never was. This was something far rarer, something far deeper. Something I could no longer explain away. And once that realization arrived, there was no going back. There is a difference between meeting someone and being affected by someone. Most people pass through our lives without leaving a permanent mark. We share conversations, we share experiences, we share moments, and eventually those moments become memories. Important perhaps, meaningful perhaps, but still memories. Contained and finished, placed neatly into the past. But every once in a while, someone arrives who doesn't remain inside the memory. They become part of the way you think, part of the way you feel, part of the way you see the world. And that's when you realize something much deeper is happening. That's what happened with you. At first, I thought I was simply getting to know you. Then I realized I was getting to know myself in ways I never expected. And honestly, that was the part that surprised me most, because I have spent most of my life understanding who I am, or at least I thought I had. I knew my habits, my routines, my strengths, my weaknesses. I knew what I valued. I knew what I avoided. I knew how close I allowed people to get. I knew where my boundaries existed. Everything felt organized, predictable, controlled. But then something strange happened. You walked into a space that I believed was already understood. And suddenly I started questioning things I'd accepted for years. Not because you challenged them directly, because your presence quietly exposed them. You made me realize how many parts of myself were operating on autopilot, how many beliefs I had never examined, how many walls I had mistaken for permanent parts of my identity. For a long time, I believed independence was my greatest strength. I believed needing no one was a form of freedom. I believed emotional distance created safety. And perhaps at one point it did. Perhaps those things helped me become who I am. But you revealed something I wasn't prepared to face. Safety and fulfillment are not the same thing. Protection and connection are not the same thing. And independence, while valuable, is not meant to become isolation. That realization didn't happen overnight. It arrives slowly, the way dawn arrives. You don't notice the exact second darkness disappears. You simply look up one day and realize everything is brighter. That's how this understanding unfolded. Little by little, moment by moment, until eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I began noticing how comfortable I felt being honest with you. Not impressive, not perfect. Honest, and honesty is much harder than people think. Most people aren't afraid of being disliked. They're afraid of being fully seen. Because being fully seen means allowing someone to witness the unfinished parts of you, the uncertain parts, the vulnerable parts, the parts still trying to figure everything out, and those are the areas we usually protect most carefully. Yet somehow around you, those defenses felt unnecessary. Not because you demanded access, because you never did. You simply created an environment where authenticity felt safer than hiding. And that changed something inside me. Because when you spend years protecting yourself, eventually the protection becomes automatic. You stop asking whether it's still needed. You stop questioning whether the walls serve a purpose. You simply live behind them until someone appears who makes you wonder what exists beyond them. And that's exactly what happened. You didn't tear down the walls. You made me curious about opening the door. There is an enormous difference between those two things. One feels like destruction. The other feels like discovery. And discovery is powerful. Because once you begin discovering parts of yourself you've ignored, everything changes. I started recognizing emotions I usually pushed aside, thoughts I normally dismissed, needs I convinced myself didn't exist. I realized how much energy it takes to constantly remain guarded, how exhausting it becomes to always anticipate disappointment, to always prepare for distance, to always assume that understanding will eventually disappear. And perhaps that's why your presence felt so refreshing, because with you, I wasn't preparing for an ending. I was simply existing inside the moment. That's rare for me, rare enough that I noticed it immediately. Normally, my mind is always moving ahead, planning, predicting, analyzing possibilities, reaching for outcomes, trying to stay one step ahead of uncertainty. But around you, that habit seemed to lose its power. For once, I wasn't focused on what might happen next. I was focused on what already existed, and what existed felt real. Not perfect, not idealized, real. There's something incredibly valuable about real things. Real things don't require constant maintenance. They don't require performance. They don't require endless validation. They simply exist consistent, reliable, the way mountains exist, the way ocean exists, the way sunlight exists. You don't question their presence because their presence speaks for itself. And that's what this connection began feeling like. Not something fragile, something genuine, something steady, something that didn't need to announce itself to prove its importance. The more I accepted that truth, the more another realization emerged. Perhaps this connection wasn't changing me into someone new. Perhaps it was helping me become someone more complete. Because there is a misconception many people carry about meaningful relationships. They believe the right person transforms you into someone else. But I don't think that's true. I think the right connection reveals parts of you that were already there. Parts waiting to be acknowledged, parts waiting to be trusted, parts waiting to be expressed. And maybe that's why this felt so significant. Not because I was losing myself, because I was finding myself. Finding aspects of my own heart that had remained hidden beneath years of caution. Finding hopes I stopped admitting. Finding trust I thought had disappeared. Finding a version of myself that still believed meaningful connection was possible. That's what changed. Not who I am. How deeply I allow myself to be who I am. And that realization has stayed with me. Because once you discover a truth about yourself, you can't unknow it. You can't return to the person you were before awareness arrived. You move forward carrying that understanding. And the understanding I carry now is simple. Before you, I thought I understood the limits of connection. I thought I knew exactly how close another person could get. I thought I knew where my boundaries ended. I thought I knew how much impact someone could have. I was wrong. Not because my previous beliefs lacked value, because they were incomplete. And sometimes all it takes is one extraordinary connection to reveal the difference between what you've always believed and what has actually been true all along. And the more I accepted that truth, the more impossible it became to imagine returning to the person I was before all of this began. The strange thing about meaningful connections is that they don't create fear immediately. At first, they create comfort. They create peace. They create a sense of familiarity that feels almost impossible to explain. You begin looking forward to conversations. You begin appreciating the presence. You begin recognizing how naturally everything flows. And for a while, that's all you notice, the comfort, the understanding, the ease. But eventually, something changes, not within the connection itself, within you. Because one day, you wake up and realize something important. This matters. And the moment something matters, vulnerability enters the picture. That's the part nobody talks about. Everyone speaks about connection. Everyone speaks about trust. Everyone speaks about love. Very few people talk about the fear that quietly follows behind them. The fear of losing something that has become valuable. And that's where I found myself. Not questioning whether this connection was real. Questioning why the thought of losing it suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Because for most of my life, I've been comfortable with endings. People leave. Circumstances change. Poly'd separate. That's reality. I've always understood that. I've always accepted it. In fact, part of me became strong because of it. I learned not to depend on permanence. I learned not to build my happiness around guarantees. I learned how to continue moving forward, regardless of who stayed and who left. And honestly, I thought that lesson was complete. I thought I had mastered it. Until you. Because suddenly I found myself confronting a feeling I hadn't experienced in a very long time. The desire for something to stay. Not out of need. Not out of attachment. Out of appreciation. There is a difference. Need says, I can't exist without this. Appreciation says, life is better because this exists. And somehow your presence became part of that second category. Life felt richer, more meaningful, more complete, not because you filled an emptiness, but because you added something beautiful to a space that already existed. And that's why the fear appeared. Not because I was dependent, because I cared. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. The walls I spent years building had protected me from many things: disappointment, heartbreak, misunderstanding, loss, but they had also protected me from something else, the possibility of genuinely valuing someone. Because when you truly value someone, there are no guarantees, no contracts, no promises from the universe, no certainty that tomorrow will look like today. You simply choose to care, despite the uncertainty, and that requires courage. Far more courage than distance ever does. Distant is easy. Distant keeps everything safe. Distant prevents risk, but distance also prevents depth. Depth requires exposure. Depth requires trust. Depth requires accepting that something meaningful could eventually hurt. And that's what I struggled with. Not the connection itself, the responsibility of allowing it to matter. Because once someone becomes important, every future possibility changes. You begin imagining their absence, not because you expect it, because you suddenly understand its impact. You realize how many thoughts include them, how many moments connect back to them, how many parts of your day feel different because they exist within it. And for someone like me, that's a difficult realization, because control has always been familiar, predictability has always been comfortable, but caring about someone introduces uncertainty. You can control your actions, you can control your decisions, you cannot control how much someone matters. That happens on its own, quietly, naturally, without asking permission. And that's exactly what happened here. I didn't decide one day that you would become important. It happened gradually, like rain filling a river, one drop at a time, almost invisible, until suddenly the entire landscape looks different. The truth is, I spent a long time trying to convince myself that this wasn't significant, that eventually everything would return to normal, that the feeling would fade, that the impact would shrink. But reality kept proving me wrong, because every attempt to minimize it only highlighted how real it had become, and eventually I had to face the truth. This connection wasn't becoming weaker, it was becoming clearer. The more honest I became with myself, the more obvious everything appeared. I wasn't afraid because something was wrong. I was afraid because something was right. And that's a completely different kind of fear. People assume fear always points toward danger. Sometimes fear points toward value. Sometimes the things we fear losing are the exact things that reveal what truly matters. And once I understood that, another realization followed. Maybe the goal was never to eliminate the fear. Maybe the goal was to understand it, because fear is often just love wearing armor. Fear is care preparing for uncertainty. Fear is the heart acknowledging significance. And if that's true, then perhaps this fear wasn't a warning. Perhaps it was evidence. Evidence that this connection had reached a place where denial was no longer possible. A place where honesty became necessary. A place where pretending no longer worked. And honesty revealed something simple. You mattered, more than I expected, more than I planned, more than I ever intended, not because of dramatic moments, not because of extraordinary events, because of consistency, presence, understanding, acceptance, the quiet things, the things most people overlook, the things that slowly become irreplaceable. That's what frightened me. Not losing control, not losing certainty, losing something rare, because rare things are difficult to replace. Rare things don't appear every day. Rare things change the way you experience life. And once you've experienced them, ordinary things never feel quite the same again. That's why I stopped running from the truth. Because avoiding it wasn't making me stronger. It was simply keeping me distant from something meaningful. And, for the first time, I found myself asking a question I never thought I would ask. Not whether this connection should matter, but what happens if I finally allow myself to fully embrace the fact that it already does? Because maybe the greatest risk isn't caring too much. Maybe the greatest risk is spending your entire life pretending you didn't care enough. And that realization led me to the most important truth of all. The fear was never falling. The fear was realizing how much I would miss you if you were gone. For a long time, I believed every important feeling needed an explanation. I thought if I analyzed this connection enough, I would eventually understand why it felt so different. But now, I realize some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be accepted. Because what matters isn't what this connection is called. What matters is what it changed. You changed the way I see trust. You changed the way I see connection. Most importantly, you changed the way I see myself. Before you, I thought strength meant standing alone. I thought protecting myself was the safest choice. I believed keeping distance was the best way to avoid disappointment. But you showed me something I never expected. Real strength isn't hiding who you are. Real strength is allowing someone to see the parts of you that you've spent years protecting. And somehow, without forcing anything, you made that possible. You never asked me to become someone else. You never demanded